Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary for splitting his time with me. This debate is taking place in a time, and I want to start by saying how deeply distressing it is to lose jobs in any industry at any time. And we know that families are suffering, that individuals are faced with great uncertainty. We've seen job losses in the past with industry sectors and activities where suddenly you lose your job and overnight a government wants to respond. So I want to talk about the things that governments have done in the past that didn't work. I want to come to that later. But I want to focus first on the irony of something that we might call in generally disruptive technologies. And it brings us back to thinking about a 2006 documentary, ironic as we stand here tonight as the clock ticks towards midnight. There was a 2006 film that was enormously popular. It was a documentary called Who Killed the Electric Car? And it documented efforts back in the mid-1990s by the state of California to pursue zero-emission vehicles, both because of the acute health impacts of smog in Los Angeles area, but also to move us on the climate crisis, to move us away from dependence on fossil fuels. Who Killed the Electric Car is a fascinating story of the development of the EV1. This was an electric car made available at the behest of government pressure. It was manufactured by General Motors. And the EV1 was then fought by industry. General Motors bought back every EV1 to destroy it. So Who Killed the Electric Car, ironically, dealt with an early effort to convince General Motors that the future lay with electric vehicles. This was pushed back by those in the big three who wanted to continue with the internal combustion engine. Earlier in debate tonight, it was mentioned that I put it in a question to one of my friends in the Conservative Party, that the closure here was anticipated, that more than a year ago, General Motors said it would be moving away from the internal combustion engine, wanted to move towards zero-emission vehicles, electric vehicles, and we didn't prepare for that in Canada. We didn't start thinking, how do we protect those jobs in Oshawa? But the response from my Conservative colleague was to say, consumer choice will rule. People will buy what they want to buy. So let's revisit this. In Canada and right now in the year 2018, the move towards electric vehicles is not because governments are demanding it. If anything, the Trump administration is moving in a different direction. The move to electric vehicles is because it's a disruptive technology which is better than the one we now have. Now, in the face of this, we did try to have, there were electric vehicle rebates put in place by the former government of Paul Martin. They were eliminated at the federal level by the former government of Stephen Harper. And to my bafflement, they have not been brought back by the new Liberal government that still needs to embrace every possible tool in the federal toolkit to have anything that looks like a plan to fight climate change. We have very little that's been done on electric vehicles by the current government federally, but it is true that disruptive technologies don't really need government help. It really helps if disruptive technologies aren't obstructed by government efforts to prop up industries that are on their way out. This is very similar to the problem we're facing in Canada right now, where we want to pretend that there's a future for the oil sands. There may be a future for the oil sands, but not mining bitumen for fuel. The future for the oil sands might be mining bitumen for petrochemical industries, for other products. But the reality is that disruptive technologies happen very fast, and if we weren't subsidizing fossil fuels as much as we are, we'd be seeing much more uptake of renewable energy. Let me just describe quickly a couple of disruptive technologies that are historical examples so they'll resonate. When the automobile came along, ironically again automobiles, when the Model T Ford came along, the horse and buggy disappeared. Now, there weren't organized lobbies in those days for people who made horsewhips and people who made buggies and people who drove the horse-drawn carriages. The disruptive technology was simply more attractive and better, and there was an industrial revolution to take up on the individual car, and it took place within a decade. Another even earlier example from the 1850s. In the 1850s, every household was lit by lamps burning whale oil. Now, we weren't yet running out of whales, although the damage done by the whaling industry was devastating on specific species. The whale oil industry didn't end because of a public movement to stop the killing of whales for oil. The whale oil industry was done in when a Nova Scotian, Gesner, figured out that now that we'd discovered coal, he could actually adapt that product to kerosene, which would burn brighter, be cheaper, and was a disruptive technology that ended the whaling industry. One of the interesting things about these disruptive technologies, and this has been demonstrated by Amory Lovins out of Rocky Mountain Institute, he's written books on this, so I recommend them to you, but what he pointed out is that the price falls for something before the demand falls. So the price of oil right now dropping has a lot to do with the fact that we're moving away from fossil fuels. The larger context needs to be remembered when we look at these things. So Amory Lovins actually has a classic photograph of the Easter parade in Manhattan, and with the caption, "Can you see the car?" And there's one Model T Ford somewhere in the background. And 10 years later, "Can you spot the horse and buggy?" Because at that point, the streets are clogged with cars. When we look at this, we have to recognize that General Motors is now making a decision because the future is moving, and General Motors doesn't want to be left behind. The future is moving to electric vehicles. The Canadian government should not want to be left behind. We need to insist and assist individuals to move to electric vehicles. We need EV charging stations that are consistent across the country. I noticed in the budget update that we received last week, there's one reference to one section of highway in Canada that's getting electric vehicle chargers. The government of Canada has the largest purchasing power of any purchaser in Canada. It should say we're not buying any cars to have internal combustion engines, we're only buying electric vehicles. That drives the marketplace, that gives us a chance to compete. And when we look at what is being manufactured in Oshawa, we should make sure those jobs are protected, but not manufacturing internal combustion engines. Should they be building windmill components there? Should they be building electric vehicles there? And we need to bear in mind the principle of just transition for workers. So I turn to the things that I can remember where lots of workers lost their jobs all at once in Canada, and really poor responses from government. Certainly one of the worst that I recall, and being from Nova Scotia, I remember it clearly, as my friend from Milton would, as she mentioned earlier in debate tonight, she's also from Cape Breton. But when Hawker Siddeley decided to close the steel mill in the late 1960s, the government panicked and said, we can't lose all those jobs, we'd better buy the steel mill. I remember Gordon Ritchie telling me once that he'd advised Alan McEachin that it would be cheaper if every year they had a helicopter hover over the doors of the steel plant, drop a bag of $60,000 for every worker, tell them to go home for the year, and that would save the taxpayers of Canada a lot of money. Alan J. McEachin told Gordon Ritchie, as I recall the story, that's probably true, but this is an election year. The result of that foolish decision was to create the largest toxic waste site in Canada that took $400 million to bury. It was never cleaned up. Another poor example of government response was when we lost our North Atlantic cod fishery, destroyed by bad Department of Fisheries and Oceans policies. Could go into that. It really was, our fishery was destroyed by DFO mismanagement. But the response to the individual fishers was to say, we're going to give you new jobs. You're going to train you up for something new. What did they think of? I remember the slogan, trade the fish net for the internet. A lot of these fishers, decent, hard-working people, had never completed high school. Trade the fish net for the internet became such a cruel joke. If we're serious about just transition for these workers, we start figuring out what just transition is going to really look like. And it's going to look like we've got trained up people who are some of the best workers in Canada. Can we train them up for the other jobs, the new clean tech jobs? By the way, we have massive shortages of skilled people in many other sectors. Can they be retrained to work in the mining industry? Can they be retrained to build different components right in Oshawa for things we really need? But we must not abandon these workers. But we do not protect these workers by destroying their children's futures, by deciding, just as we did by creating toxic waste that killed not only the workers but their children in the Sydney tar ponds. We don't support these workers by letting their grandchildren die, by clinging to fossil fuels and the internal combustion engine. We move into the future.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for St. John's East.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And the honourable member gave some wonderful remarks. In one particular point, she did refer to the cod fishery. Of course, that's an issue dear to my heart. I remember I was in first-year University at Queen's when the moratorium was declared. It was quite a shock to everyone because we have such an emotional connection to the fishery as Newfoundlanders and the importance it had to our economy. And then, of course, the population dropped by almost 80,000 people. Now, the issue that the member raises regarding how the retraining worked, I mean, the retraining might not have worked for all people in the fishery, but it certainly, trained a generation of young Newfoundlanders and Labradorians into industries that didn't exist. And so they've gone off into the rest of the country and done quite well. Some 80,000 of them have gone around the country to do quite well in various fields, including in the internet, working in Silicon Valley or in Toronto or in Boston or wherever else their skills may have taken them. And so I would like the member to comment a little bit on how important it is to make sure that the folks in Oshawa are provided opportunities in their communities so they continue to maintain their roots and the opportunities with the people they've grown up with and to maintain those community roots that are so important to all of us. Thank you.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you to my friend from St. John's East. I can recognize that as a university student, he may have been shocked, but I've been working for years with the inshore fishermen who'd gone to federal court to try to reduce the quota so that the jobs wouldn't be lost. They weren't shocked. And as they always put it, the moratorium wasn't declared by the Government of Canada. It was declared by National Sea Products and Fisheries Products International when they had scooped up the last fish and couldn't find anything because they had taken over the offshore with draggers that destroyed that fishery with the support of DFO and with the support of the government at the time. I refer to the TAGS program. I tell my friend from St. John's East, the fisheries retraining process did not help the workers who were on those fishing boats. They were devastated. We lost 30,000 jobs overnight. And while a new generation went out of Newfoundland to find jobs elsewhere, we have an economy in Newfoundland now that is swimming in red ink because of the idiotic decision to build Muskrat Falls. We have a situation where the jobs didn't come back in the small communities. And if I can just say one thing to the current government, if you come up with a program for helping the workers, make it community-based, not individual. Because if that TAGS program, which was a lot of money wasted, had gone to groups of workers, organized through their union, what do you want to do to create new opportunities? They will come up with better ideas than the federal government will.
Questions and comments? The honourable member Durham.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I found the exchange interesting between the Green Party leader and my friend, the Liberal MP from St. John's East. The one place he omitted where most Newfoundlanders went after the moratorium is Fort McMurray, Madam Speaker, so much so that Newfoundland politicians go there because a lot of people went to work hard to provide for their families. And what is disappointing for me at this late hour is the member from Trinity Spadina and the member from the leader of the Green Party are using this as an opportunity to talk about a future they would like to see and not living in reality. The reality is a lot of Newfoundlanders are working in our resource sector. A lot of families are driving their minivans. We don't have a dream world scenario right now where the internal combustion engine is obsolete. The member might like that, but it's not the reality. The reality is the U.S. market, people are buying trucks, not sedans. So what we have to do is work with our domestic industry. Right now, we're not competitive. We can build more efficient cars, but we have to be competitive in terms of the marketplace here. So would the member not recognize that we have to come up with policies that recognize consumer trends, consumption, and the fact that we are burning fossil fuels today? It's little solace to families talking about a future in the present that doesn't exist.
The honourable member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
With all due respect to my honourable colleague from Durham, if the world wasn't moving to electric vehicles, General Motors wouldn't be closing the plant to say it's now moving to no longer make internal combustion engines. That's a business decision made in Detroit. I want for the workers of Oshawa and all the supply chain that's impacted by this devastating decision to know that we're capable of shifting gears and producing vehicles, which, by the way, are not only important because that's where the market is shifting, that's where disruptive technologies are shifting, but that's where we must shift. And the Conservative Party must take account of the science that says if we don't hold to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we will lose human civilization. That's something that matters to every single person in this place, and the Conservative Party better get some science tutorials.